Ultimately, the story of the luxury watch is one of creators and collectors. Today, we're privileged to welcome a longtime friend and Patek Philippe collector, Rick Remiker. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate the invite.
Now, Brian, Rick's been with us a long time, and he's been with Patek Philippe even longer. So let's tell the tale of how you discovered this brand. What was the origin of this passion?
Well, I think like a lot of people, you migrate, from maybe a more entry-level watch into collecting Rolex or owning one or two Rolex, and then aspirationally, early in my collecting journey, I didn't really think that I'd be able to afford or acquire a Patek Philippe watch. And for our 20th wedding anniversary, my wife and I were in New York shopping for watches and not really knowing what I wanted, but I looked at a 5196P Calatrava and I just fell in love with the watch, fell in love with the dial, and that sort of set my collecting journey, my Patek collecting journey on its way.
Now, the 5196P, I've always thought is the ultimate 5196. What gripped you? What really captured your heart with that watch?
Two things, really the sort of a brushed stainless sector on the dial, as well as the Breguet style numerals. And it was just, I thought the other references in the 5196 series were a little austere, plain, and I thought that the P had a little more pop.
So from that departure point, where did your collection go? Did you buy more impulsively, emotionally, or did you have a plan?
I didn't really have a plan. It was more just about learning about the brand. The next watch that I acquired was the 5524 Travel Time, a watch that at the time I was traveling a great deal on the road, typically 3 or 4 days a week, and it was both practical and extremely clear dial and useful. So that was a great watch to have. I have it to this day. I wear the heck out of it. The case has lots of scratches and dings to show my love marks. And that wasn't a particularly popular watch when it first came out because Patek, as I understand it, didn't really have a pilot watch heritage. But nonetheless, it appealed to me. I think it's a nice size and a beautiful dial.
And it really is a fascinating piece, Brian, because first of all, you've got incredible practicality with the loom. You've got good size, but not ostentation. And it is a little bit of a different genre, because a lot of folks didn't see Patek launching a pilot watch back then.
Yeah, I think when the brand launched the watch, for them, it was a whole new category. And they made sure to mention and to highlight the fact that there was a historical significance for them producing pilot's watches, examples from the museum. And when they launched the watch, they did it with their very easy to use GMT functionality, which had already been pre-existing on the Travel Time Aquanaut. And so I think that, as you mentioned, it served a great purpose. It's easy to use. At 42 millimeters, it was one of the larger watches that they were producing at the time, or when they came out with the watch. And I just think it was a casual, upscale aesthetic, but that it lent itself to being able to wear, with exactly what you're wearing today, or even dress down a little bit more.
Now, I realize there are more Patek Philippe watches in your collection, but the theme that unifies all of these here is complication. Is that by accident or design?
No, I'm probably drawn more to chronographs and dual-time watches and more complicated watches as opposed to time-only or time-only in date. I have some of those in my collection, but I like a little bit more complicated watch.
And Brian, in particular right here, we've got a little bit of stainless steel that I didn't see coming. We have 3 steel watches, no Nautilus. What's your take on this?
I think that it sort of just highlights the fact that, Rick has a broad range of interests when it comes to watchmaking. And I think that he always tends to target things that are a little bit more esoteric, but that are also significant to the brand. And one of my, favorite watches that we have here today, I'm a big fan of all of them, is the 5960 with the black dial. So this is a annual calendar flyback chrono on a stainless steel bracelet. The first stainless steel, the 5960 series, the second iteration. But what's so significant about this watch is that they ended the series on the black dial, and that they produced this particular watch for less than a year. And so it's a very rare bird and not something that you see very often in the wild.
Yeah, Rick, they made this watch for only one model year, and it was actually only built for a few months. Did you pick it for its rarity, or did the black dial grab you?
I picked it for the black dial and the red chronograph hand, and on the first of the month, there's a red 1 date. And I just think that pops so much. I'm a dial aesthetics guy. First and foremost, it's dial to me. more than anything else. And I like the white dial version of that watch a great deal, but the black was available to me and more rare. And it's a watch that I wear a great deal. I like it a lot.
There is a lot of steel on the table. Are you a Nautilus guy? Are you an Aquanaut guy? Or are you primarily steel dress watches?
You know, I'm probably more neutral on the Nautilus than a lot of people. I don't dislike it, but I wouldn't chase it. I've owned a 5712 and a 5990 travel time chronograph, both wonderful watches. I'm not a huge fan of 5711. You know, probably an oddball compared to the rest of the watch collecting community, given the hype over that watch. You know, and now I think I've never owned an Aquanaut, but I've got my sights set on an Aquanaut. I retired a couple of years ago, so moving into something with a rubber strap and a little bit more of an everyday casual watch fits my lifestyle better.
You do have a lot of sporty or sports watches on the table here. You've got the dual time Pilot, you've got the weekly calendar, obviously the two flyback chronograph annual calendars, and a very, very retro-inspired formal retrograde perpetual calendar. Where did the passion for that watch come from? Was it love at first sight, or did you court it first?
I was drawn to by a friend and fellow collector in Cleveland who owned the rose gold version of that watch, and I just loved the dial. And then when you think about Perpetual Calendar Patek Philippe's, they're more rare. And very, what's interesting about Patek is you've got a lot of references that trade around retail. You've got some references that trade crazy amount above retail. And then a watch like that trades at a discount to retail. And I think longer term, this has great collecting potential. But it's also just a beautiful functional watch to wear. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I think it straddles that dress casual realm.
And there is so much about this watch that's emblematic of Patek Philippe, from the perpetual calendar complication to the officer's case, the hunter case back, the reasonable size. It looks larger than its 38 millimeters. And the use of the guilloche, the blackened white gold hands, there's a lot that's striking here, and all of it achieved without scale. It's not a big watch.
And it's not a cluttered dial. For all of the information that's contained on a perpetual calendar watch, I think it's clear and crisp and easy to read.
And to me, it looks like a Patek Philippe, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, you've got signature elements here, from the apertures to the retrograde date, that I think has become synonymous with them. And what drew me to the watch when I first saw it was the guilloche dial. I mean, it's something that when you delve into the brand a little bit deeper, you learn just how rare the dials are, and that they're reserved for their most special pieces. And if you have the opportunity to visit the factory, you get to see that the dial maker that's making these watches is really only capable of making upwards of two dials a day. And that it's almost a lost art at this point. And so it's special because you know that inherently it's limited to what they can produce because they can only make so many of the dial.
It's also interesting to me to see how this design evolved over time, as the 5159 has a dramatically different look than the original 5050 that debuted this retrograde perpetual calendar. They were not afraid to blow up something that was already working pretty well and try a revolutionary reboot of the design.
Yep.
So this is a fascinating watch among what we have here, but it is not the most, shall we say, progressive or contemporary. That would have to be the 5905 in steel. Do you think this is what it should have been from the beginning?
I think so. You know, that's a really subtle, more olive green dial. And I really like the bracelet. I love 5096 flyback chrono, but the bracelet is a little more dressy. I call it a little more blingy. I think the bracelet on the 5905 straddles that dress casual realm a little bit better.
Without a doubt, it looks to me nothing so much as the bracelet that's actually on the Aquanaut. If you see the Aquanaut with the bracelet, it is this bracelet design. And it's definitely sportier. I think this multi-link design with small cross sections, full polish, many individual links, it's almost reminiscent of something like the Rolex Jubilee, whereas this is a little bit more reminiscent of the Oyster. It's the big design, staggered alignment, staggered finish, a 3-link profile, and the size of the case is different.
40 versus 42, I think they both work. Until you put them side by side, it's a little bit difficult to tell. If I put them on my wrist, I really don't feel a difference between a 40 and a 42. But I think they both work.
Now, the funny thing about the 5905 is that it's a watch that's difficult to read if you're just looking at it from head on, because there's so much sculpting in the profile.
when the 5905 first came out, you have to look at what else they were producing at the time. And so when they launched it in the blue and the black dials and platinum, it was the largest, call it dress watch that they had in the collection outside of the ultra grand comps that were a little bit bigger because they had bigger movements. So when the watch came out, you had the 5159 that was in the collection. You had the other retrograde Perpetual, which was the 5496. And these watches maxed out at 40 millimeters. And so if you were looking for a larger dress watch from the brand, it really didn't exist until you went into the ultra high complication minute repeaters. And so this watch really bridged that gap. It offered somebody who may have had other sport watches the opportunity to purchase something that was a little bit bigger or more significant on the wrist. And I think them transitioning it into stainless steel was, for them, the right move, because they hit the same note and the same client that the 5960 hit, and they're able to offer optionality to somebody that may not be purchasing or may not be a fan of the Nautilus line.
Now, the other thing that's interesting here is that a lot of these watches being fairly contemporary in recent production and in stainless steel, but not sports watches. Patek has discontinued the 5711. As more potential production is opened up for steel, remember traditionally Patek's been 15 to 20% of production in steel. To make up the difference, Patek has introduced more and more steel watches recently, and one of the most memorable is the 5212A. How did this grab you?
Well, when that was introduced, I thought this is so non-Patek-like. That dial just looked so contemporary and different. And when you heard the story on how that dial came about, it's a watch that I knew that I really wanted to have in my collection. It's one of those watches that is better in real life. The subtlety of the hour markers and the color and the dial and the formation originally of the handwritten script. It's just so different. I don't know how practical it is, particularly for Americans, to have a weekly calendar complication, but it's a beautiful dial and a beautiful watch.
Without a doubt. It's a very important watch because in some ways it predicted the era that we're in now, where we've had a lot of steel dress style watches. We've had the 5905 in steel, the 4947 annual calendar in steel. We had the 6007 limited edition. And now here we have a steel watch that preceded all of those and perhaps heralded their arrival, with steel being a bigger presence in the Patek dress watch family. Tell me a little bit about this dial, because some of our viewers don't know the story there.
Well, as I understand it, this was a prototype, and the dial was designed by one of the designers at Patek Philippe as a mock-up, and Thierry Stern really fell in love with the mock-up and decided to produce the dial in that handwritten font as opposed to making a more formalized font. So that's very different. To me, that was a little whimsical and a little different and a little non-Patek-like.
And it is interesting to see the company occasionally do things that are unprecedented. They didn't have a history of pilots' watches. They didn't have a history of hand-drawn dials. And this watch, in addition to being sort of the vanguard of a new generation of steel Patek dress watch, was also the vehicle for the launch of the new generation of automatic caliber inside.
Yeah, beautiful. Love, as they've moved to more hacking movements, I love that factor. So, it's just continuous improvement throughout the line.
And from this watch, of course, that movement would later find its way into the sports watches. A lot of folks sometimes fault Patek for keeping older movements in production for a long time, but there is a lot of innovation on the technical front, and I think that's part of what draws us to the brand.
For sure. No, I think that the reality is, if it's not broke, don't fix it, unless there's going to be a real advancement. And I think that that's what they specialize at, right? I mean, coming up with something unique and different and relaunching it when it's perfect. And for me, that's the new 6119. The 5119 was in production a long time, and there were people talking about just that this movement has been used for so long and that they need to transition out, and lo and behold, they came out with a brand new movement. It's gorgeous, and it's legitimately better in every single way.
And I think, Brian, in addition to that, the 5326 that was introduced earlier this year, the annual calendar travel time watch with, I guess, that they call it sort of the pebbled camera body case, I think that's a very contemporary look, very functional complication. And as I understand it, that watch the dial was designed in conjunction with the next generation, Thierry Stern's sons. And I think that's it's a really cool element for the brand.
And I think it does really force us to change our expectations, because as long as the 315s and the 335s, the 215s and the 240s were the mainstay of the collection, we got used to this idea that Patek would evolve the case and the dial, but not necessarily the movement. And now most of the Patek Philippe movements in production now have arrived on the market since 2006.
No, and I think that you can sort of see the direction that the brand's going, and this is almost a refreshing of the entire collection. And it started actually with quite a few of the watches here on the table, because thematically, I mean, again, when you talk about the 5905, it's not just the next iteration of the 5905. The olive green dial shows thematically that Patek is doing certain things throughout the entire collection, which is different than what they had done in the past. Because you have the olive green dial on the Lady Steel 24, you have it on the automatic 24, you had it on the 5711, you have it on the new 5205. So they're now doing things thematically across multiple product categories, which I think you're going to see continue, but then have smaller production runs. So I think you'll see something come, you'll have an olive dial, it'll be here for a brief period, and then it'll be gone.
Yep.
And what it creates a further element of scarcity amongst the product.
So could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the hidden collection, maybe even the collection to come and your future ambitions as a Patek collector?
Yeah, again, have my eyes on either a Aquanaut Travel Time or Aquanaut Chronograph, one of the varieties. There's a number of those. Of course, very difficult to acquire these days, so it requires a great deal of patience. I'd love to have a rose gold version of the 5990. Again, very difficult. Would love to see it in person. Might be a little too, much, but I love the weight and the heft of that watch, and would love to see that in the rose gold as well.
Is there any vintage on your radar?
I'm not much of a vintage guy. Brian actually introduced me to Roger Dubuis a number of years ago through some videos that were done, and I've collected a couple of vintage Roger Dubuis watches, but I'm more of a modern era collector than vintage.
Now, a lot of folks use the term Grail watch interchangeably with a major goal. Do you believe a Grail watch, philosophically, is something that should be theoretically possible or always beyond reach? And then what is your Grail watch by that definition?
Yeah, I think that's up to each individual collector. I don't think that I could ever have a Grail watch, because my tastes evolve, they change. I definitely know about myself that once I acquire what I believe is my Grail watch, then there's something else above and beyond that comes down the road. So like a lot of collectors, I've migrated into a number of independent brands. But in the Patek line, I think there's a number of things that I'd love to have. I'd love to have a close-in a world time someday. So there's just a number of aspirational, a perpetual chronograph. There's just a number of complications that I think are very classic Patek Philippe that I think will find its way into my collection at some point.
So if you guys were the man behind the curtain, what is a watch from Patek that you guys would like to see?
Well, personally, I'd like to see something ultra thin. I think it's a great technical challenge. Patek has exhausted its options and complications. I think they've proved they can do anything. I think sometimes less is more. And a watch that makes no compromises for water resistance, automatic winding, practicality, that's under 5 millimeters would be uncharted territory for them. Right now, they've relied on the 5711 and the Golden Ellipse line to an extent to serve that ultra-thin customer, but I think right now the greatest challenge is to make a watch that is uncompromised, thin, functional, and because it's unlike anything else they have in their catalog right now, it would be a new frontier.
And I'd just love to see expansion of steel, dress, and sport watches beyond Nautilus and Aquanauts. I think that's just a great line extension, and I think Patek's done a really nice job of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you saw from the launches this year that that's where the focus was, right? Product extensions in the non-sport lines. For me, it would have to be a 7150, which is a ladies' manual wind chronograph, but without the diamond bezel. And so just pump pushers, Breguet numerals, 38 millimeter size. Like for me, like cool lugs, like the watch is just legitimately perfect. And they made it for women. So I asked them if they would make the watch without a diamond bezel, thinking that I was like this creative, unique individual. And they said that they've been asked every which way to do that watch. So it just shows that there's demand for it.
I guarantee you that they wouldn't have admitted they'd been asked if they weren't seriously entertaining the possibility.
Could be.
Would be awesome.